As we record this, the stock market has plummeted some 592 points, and there are what appear to be riots or demonstrations in the streets of Hong Kong. They've moved on from the airport out into the streets. That sets the context on this episode of Bill Whittle Now. Bill, President Trump has been very tough with China when it comes to tariffs and other kinds, and tough talk, frankly. But he's not been as tough when it comes to rebuking them for their anti-democratic treatment of Hong Kong. Does it seem to you that America has given up its moral leadership in the world?
I don't think that's necessarily true. And moral leadership is leadership by example. I mean, you can't very well expect to provide any kind of a moral lever on somebody unless you're admired and widely recognized as a moral person or a moral nation or whatever the case may be. Certainly, the U.S. has an enormous, almost unimaginable moral advantage over China in terms of how it treats its own people. But the only thing that we actually have in the American interest in terms of China is our economic relationship. Now, that's the American interest, and that's the one that the president should be protecting. As far as the moral issues go, you are talking about a culture that certainly for most of us, virtually all of my life, well, except for the last 10 years, I guess, the population was essentially a peasant population. I did a documentary in 2001 on China, and we had footage from 2000 and from 1993. You couldn't cut the two together. In 1993, they were riding bicycles and living in stone huts with dirt floors. In 2000, they're standing on corners with cell phones, waiting for their BMW. So I guess what I'm saying here is that China is going its own way, and the improvements in the life of the average Chinese person are essentially monumental because they basically started from the Stone Age as far as modern things are concerned. I'm not entirely sure what the specific objectives of the Hong Kong protesters are, but I don't see the kind of mass slaughter that we saw in Rwanda or in the Balkans or anything like that. In other words, I don't see anything that is calling for American action, diplomatic, economic, or otherwise, in terms of large-scale oppression of their own people. The Chinese people have gotten infinitely richer as a result of trade, and unless the Chinese government starts massacring their own people, I'm not entirely sure that we have a horse in that race.
Well, the incidents that we're seeing now in the airport and then have spilled out into the streets are the result of new rules related to extradition treaties, where the mainland Chinese government basically said that it would be able to extradite people from Hong Kong to stand trial in China. Hong Kong saw this not only as a problem in its own right, but also as a slippery slope of increasing Chinese encroachment on the individual rights of people in Hong Kong. So there's a broader underlying concern there. But President Trump seems to have been very coy when it comes to how to deal with this sort of diplomatic incident, if you want to call it that. He hasn't said much. His Secretary of State, Mike Pompeo, his Vice President, Mike Pence, have both been relatively actively engaged and calling for democratic processes in Hong Kong. But President Trump himself seems to have been almost patting Chinese Premier Xi Jinping on the back, saying he's dealing with significant restraint. He's conducted himself with significant restraint. And we get word this week that the Trump administration has decided to forego or forestall new tariffs that were supposed to happen in September and push those off till after Christmas. Bill, it looks like not only has Trump ceded the moral territory, but he's blinked on the economic argument as well.
Or you could make exactly the opposite case, that by reducing or postponing the tariffs, he's trying to lower the pressure cooker in China and give them time to get this thing resolved more easily. You could certainly make that case, and I think that's a more sensible case to make. Donald Trump does not appear to have been particularly shy about smacking China when China needed to be smacked, and it needed to be smacked pretty badly. The thing that you said in that last segment that I actually found quite astonishing was that there is even a discussion about extradition from Hong Kong to China. China took over Hong Kong in 1999 from the British. Hong Kong is not an independent nation. Hong Kong is Chinese territory.
But it's an independent system. It's one country, two systems of government.
Okay, fair enough. But nevertheless, it is Chinese territory. It is part of China's sovereign territory, and I had no idea, frankly, that there was still such an incredible wall between the two that this even was a possible, let alone an issue. It seems incredible to me that Hong Kong is able to refuse extradition to China. I'm really quite surprised at that.
Now, last I heard, China had basically backed off and put it on hold, this extradition move, has not taken it off the table, but put it on hold, and is basically making the argument, well, we're not doing it, so what's all the hubbub about? But Bill, I really want to get down to this great negotiator that we hired to be president of the United States, who first does something that Republicans used to find abhorrent, and that is put protectionist trade tariffs in place, and ostensibly as a negotiating tool. And now he's blinked, but he hasn't used the excuse that you just gave, that he's giving the Chinese government room to maneuver and deal with their situation in Hong Kong, for example. He's made the argument that he didn't want prices to go up for American consumers during the Christmas season. And yet previously, the president has said there's been no negative economic impact from his previous tariffs. And in fact, vast sums of cash have come into the U.S. Treasury. He can't have it both ways, can he, Bill?
No, I agree you can't. If it turns out that my theory is correct, then he should have stated that pretty much openly. And I think even if that is just a partial reason for why he did what he did, he should have been savvy enough to understand that was an important distinction to make. As far as the tariffs go, like all conservatives, I believe in free trade, and I think that free trade is not only essential to our own prosperity, but to the prosperity of the world. And the reason I don't have a particularly large problem with Donald Trump putting tariffs on China is because he's not putting tariffs on the entire world. He's putting it on a country that has, over the course of the last 30 years, taken obscene advantage of our generosity, our decency, and our tolerance. Obscene advantage of it. And frankly, I think they were long overdue for a taste of this kind of retaliatory medicine. I think this is human nature. If I'm in a business relationship with you, and I continue to sell you products at less than what I think they're worth, I've got nobody to complain about that to but myself. And the more you continue to allow people to take advantage of you, the more they become not only used to taking advantage of you, the more incentivized they are to take advantage of you even more, to see where that line is. So if we were talking about tariffs as a way of funding the government, or if we were talking about tariffs as something universally out there to protect the American worker or so on, I'd have a lot more problem with it than I do now. To me, the tariffs are an extraordinarily powerful lever to keep our number one economic rival at least on the field in terms of playing fair where the out-of-bounds lines are. The Hong Kong issue, I don't often find myself siding with the communist Chinese on this, and I don't know the details of this, so I'm fully prepared for the backlash that's going to hit me. But I don't see how what the Chinese government is doing is much different than the kind of attitude that I would have in this country towards things like sanctuary cities and sanctuary states. If California were to declare, well, it essentially has, if it declares itself independent of the federal government when it comes to issues of international concern and not just local government, if California said, well, yes, technically we do fly the American flag, but we do things differently here, so we're not going to obey federal law, I wouldn't stand for that. And until I know more about the situation, I don't see how the government of mainland China is doing anything more than rather gingerly so far reminding the people of Hong Kong whose flag is flying over the place.
Bill, I wonder if things like tariffs and trade disputes like this are really an artifact of the past, given the fact that the Chinese government holds so much of U.S. debt, given the fact that we buy so much of China's stuff and they buy a good deal of our stuff as well. When will we get to the point when we stop treating them as an adversary and start seeing them as essentially integrated with our economy?
When they start playing by the rules, Scott. And I mean, when I say the rules, I don't mean our rules. I mean the international rules. Copyright law, just as the first thing that floats into mind. Just off the top of my head, and I don't believe this is anything like the most significant issue, but there are pirated copies of Spider-Man being sold in China right now. And I don't mean on the streets either. They're just basically stealing the stuff. They're stealing the logos. They're stealing they're stealing the brands. They're stealing all of this stuff. They're not playing by the rules. And when Donald Trump became president, instead of accepting another 4 years of us getting basically rolled by this country that refuses to play by international rules, he decided to say, no, we're going to fight back now. We're not the chumps that we used to be. And if you want to play by the rules and play fair, then we'll drop the tariffs. And if not, then we'll raise them. I think that's not only smart and in our best interest, I think that's just plain fundamental human common sense, is to not reward somebody for being your adversary. You reward them for being your friend. You reward them for being your partner. You don't reward them for screwing you over. You punish them for that. And if you don't understand that, you don't understand human nature. So that part of the equation seems pretty clear to me. Now, when you say that that China owns so much of our debt and so on, that the whole idea of tariffs is really meaningless, I categorically disagree. There's no question that they own a lot of our debt, but that's not what concerns the fundamental Chinese citizen. And I understand they don't have the same influence over their government that we do, or used to anyway. But certainly the Chinese government is keenly aware of the mood of the Chinese people. So if Donald Trump adds a tariff to Chinese power tool maker, let's say, and that power tool maker sees a precipitous drop in his income, in their income, that has an effect. That makes those people unhappy, and it makes them complain to their government. And enough complaints to the government start to get the government's attention. To say that having sales of Chinese products decreases doesn't really affect China because they own all of our debt is true to the degree that the debt is owed, but that's no comfort for somebody who's running a guy who manufactures, foam we're number one fingers for, football games. That guy has got to sell product, and he sells his product overseas in America because he can make it more cheaply than it can be made here or elsewhere because of his cheap labor. If Donald Trump's tariffs on China mean that advantage in price disappears, then that guy's out of business. And if he's out of business, he's not happy. And if he's out of business, he's no longer contributing money to the state of China. He's actually now on the dole to some degree. So I think it's an extremely effective, nonviolent, and essentially voluntary way to deal with things. It's basically saying what you're doing is unfair and wrong. You know it. You're not denying it. So we're telling you, you can now either play by the rules or suffer the consequences. Your decision. And I find that to be very effective.
Well, here's to you, Mr. Giant Foam Finger Maker. We toast you, those hardworking people, whatever side of the ocean they're on. Ladies and gentlemen, those of you who are contributing to the production of these shows at BillWhittle.com because of your membership here can take comfort in knowing that you are also providing many copies of this that are illegally pirated and overdubbed into Mandarin across the sea. So you're actually helping to educate people on both sides of the pond. And Cantonese, and I'm sure any variety of other languages into which these episodes are pirated. We want to thank the members at BillWhittle.com for making this possible. For Bill Whittle, I'm Scott Ott.